Science. She is a pediatric infectious disease consultant who works as a clinician and teaches at the Faculty of Medicine at the Universitas Indonesia. She's currently pursuing a PhD and has been involved in a trial comparing different approaches to dengue control, such as vaccination, and also exploring the role of Wolbachia. So we're very excited about your talk. Thank you so much for joining us today. We're curious to listen to what you're going to tell us and to learn more about control strategies for dengue in Indonesia. And with this, I'll hand over to you, Nina.
Thank you, Mirna, for the nice introduction. Good afternoon and also good evening for everyone. So I will start to share my slide. Okay. So first of all, I'm Nina. I'm from Jakarta, Indonesia. It is the capital city of Indonesia. And I will give you a brief introduction about my city. It is looks like an urban city, which is quite famous with the traffic jam and also crowded area because during I think afternoon the population will be double, and in the evening the population will be half of the afternoon population. So we'll talk about the dengue and beyond, and we'll share our experience about the dengue. So I will start with the introduction to our fire study, which is exploring the etiologies of febrile illness in Indonesia. And we found that the most common cause of the febrile illness in Indonesia is dengue viruses. As you can see in here, there are several etiologies, but I will highlight only two of them, which is mosquito carrier disease, dengue viruses, and also chikungunya virus. So I will start with the case first to give you a little bit of overview about what we are see in the field. So I have the 5 days old baby presenting to our hospital with the premature rupture of membrane of the mother, and at the time mother was also diagnosed with dengue shock syndrome with the lowest platelet around 35,000 with IgM positive and IgG positive of dengue serology with at the time mother delivered under general anesthesia, and unfortunately the mother was deceased. And this baby born with the active resuscitation and need the oxygen support, but fortunately he is stable at age of 10 hours and no need for oxygen support. So this patient we did the follow-up. Interestingly, he developed the fever at day 3 of age, which at the time we do repeat NS1 antigen, which is previously negative, and then after that we repeat at the 3rd day of illness, and it is positive. And we see over time the decrease of platelet, and the lowest part is 34,000, but he is quite stable, and we just only need to give him the IV fluid maintenance. And on day 8, he finally discharged and stepped down to the general ward. And our final diagnosis is neonatal dengue. And the second case is we received a referral from the district hospital. The boy, 10 years old boy with the altered consciousness in the last 2 days prior to the hospital admission. And on day 1, he had complained having a high fever with headache, nausea, and vomiting. And parents noticed that he slept most of the day, not willing to talk or eat, and no spontaneous bleeding, and had watery stool for 1 time. And on 2nd day of illness or fever, he got a generalized seizure for 5 minutes and have altered consciousness become worsened, and he both to emergency room in district hospital and diagnosed at the time with encephalitis and referred to our tertiary hospital since they think that it is the herpes encephalitis and need to give antiviruses. At our hospital, the GCS was 12, hemodynamically quite stable, have fever 38.5 degrees, no abnormalities in the physical examination, including the neurological examination, and also no meningeal sign at the time. So at the tertiary hospital, we noticed that there is a thrombocytopenia at the time, and the attending doctor at the time checked for the NS1 antigen and it is positive with the CRP 26.5, abnormal electrolyte, also blood sugar, and also slightly increase of ALT, AST at the time. And at the time, we decided to do the lumbar puncture because the thrombocyte is still above the 50,000. And we found that a slightly increase of cell count, but unremarkable the cell count, I mean the differential count with increase of protein, decrease of glucose, and the brain MRI also normal. So during the follow-up, he is fully alert at day 5. We only noticed there is a petechia, no major abdominal bleeding, and discharged without neurological sequelae. During the follow-up, he is also stable hemodynamically. The lowest platelet around 2,000, and we noticed the dengue NS1 in serum and as well as in CSF is positive, dengue IgM positive in serum, negative in CSF, and both IgG negative both in serum and CSF. And we revealed that from the PCR in CSF, there is a DENV serotype 3, and we do the genotyping at the time, and we found that it is still similar what previously reported in Indonesia, but we found novel mutation in the some of the protein. At the time, our final diagnosis is dengue encephalitis. We exclude for dengue encephalopathisis since he is quite stable hemodynamically and no abnormalities in other metabolic problem. And now let's see about dengue burden. Overall, we know that dengue is the global burden, not only in certain countries anymore. And as you know that in 2024, Indonesia became the first country in Asia with the highest number of dengue cases, accounting for 66% of dengue-related death in Asia. But in 2025, we are ranked number 2. Philippines no number 1, but still the number of dengue cases is quite high in our country. So WHO announced that dengue is one of the neglected tropical disease, and they targeted the some of the indicators such as the CFR, especially in 2030 should be 0. Case fatality rate, and also the number of countries able to detect and respond to dengue outbreak is become 75%, and as well as to reduce the burden of the disease and its incident by 25% from 3 million plus to 2.3.5 million. So in our data in Indonesia, as you can see here, a lot of our province is red. In the middle is my island with Leni and Riyadi, which is Java Island, and it is hyper endemic for dengue. And as you can see here, in 2024, the incidence rate of dengue in our country is 91.9 with the case fatality rate 0.57. But thankfully in 2025 is decreased to 28.1, and the case fatality rate also slightly increased. And we realized that after more than 50 years since dengue was diagnosed in Indonesia, despite factor controls, effort, and also there are a lot of improvement, still the dengue incidence in Indonesia still exists and continues to rise. Why we are really concerned as a pediatrician, because we are basically with the background of pediatric infectious disease, because as you can see in here, the burden of dengue occurs mostly in age 5 to 44 years old. But as you can see here in Indonesia, the mortality rate is higher in age 5 to 14 years old. And as you can see in here, this is the study in our research group that seroprevalence of dengue in Indonesia in 2070 according to age. You can see that in age group 1 to 4, the seroprevalence is 33 and increased over time to 89 in adolescent group age. So we are also have the very diverse serotype. We have all the serotype of dengue in Indonesia from DEN 1, DEN 2, DEN 3, and DEN 4. And it is across the country. And the risk of secondary infection, which is lead to more severe cases, is also increased while the 4 serotype is circulating all over in Indonesia. So as you can see, the 5-year trend of dengue cases highlighted that the increase is higher in 2024, even though the case fatality rate over time is decreased. So this is one of my PhD project. As you can see here, we want to see the difference between the case before and after COVID. As you can see here, after COVID, we noticed there are increasing, even like doubling number of dengue case, as well as this hospitalization, and also the mortality of dengue case in our hospital database from Indonesian Health Insurance. You know that in Indonesia, we have the National Health Insurance, and we collect this data from the National Health Insurance database. So we also have our study, we call it RENDengue. We just want to measure the correlation between the climate and also the dengue, especially in my city in Jakarta. As you can see here, the peak of dengue case in our country is around February to April. It's consistent. I think starting from 2019 up to 2025 is still consistent with February to April or May, and it is if you can see in the below graph, it is consistent with also the rainfall in Jakarta. And from this data, we also have the interesting finding that the 2-month lag means that there is a gap between the cumulative rainfall and then the increased case of the dengue cases. We see that there are 2 months lag after the cumulative rainfall, and also the increase of temperature and also the exposure of sunshine. So by this from this study, we learned that we have 2 months critical time to make our strategy each year after we have the season. So yeah, I think this is just to show you this picture, just to show you more rain, more breeding ground. I think it's like already the same with many different countries with the dengue. And we also noticed that the average of temperature also good for the egg hatching for the mosquito. And also we realized that the humidity around 68 to 80% is will cause the longer lifespan of mosquito, which is in our data. We have the humidity around that limit. So I will start with the strategy for dengue prevention and control from WHO, which is divided into 4 technical elements, which consists of the diagnosis and case management, integrated surveillance, outbreak and preparedness, sustainable vector control, as well as the future vaccine implementation. In our country, we follow the guideline for management of dengue, diagnosis and management of dengue using WHO TDR 2009, but we realize as clinician, it's not really easy to manage the dengue cases because we are need to balance between the shock and overload. And we are realized in our setting, overload also the one of leading cause of mortality, because if someone didn't really realize when to stop the fluid management, and it will lead to death due to overload. And we also noticed that the diagnostic for rapid antigen also still an issue because it's not available in all over public health center or community health center in Indonesia. And in dengue, we uh, only rely on the symptomatic management or like supportive treatment, because no specific treatment for antiviruses. And as you can see, there is a list of research ongoing currently for the management of dengue, but the conclusion is not there yet. So I will start with introducing our national strategic plan for innovative dengue prevention, which consists of the factor management, as well as improving access and quality of dengue case management, surveillance, sustainability, community engagement to raise the awareness, and also government engagement. And the last is improving assessment and intervention, and also innovation, which in this talk I will discuss more about Wolbachia and also dengue vaccination. So I just want to show you from 1968, since the dengue were diagnosed in Indonesia, we have several strategy, which is a lot of working on the factor control, how to educate the community, how to do the cleaning of environment, but we still have the high number of cases of dengue. So that's why everybody try to found innovative, which is one of the study conduct in Indonesia, starting in Yogyakarta province. This is not my study, but my college study. So it is Wolbachia program, as you probably read in the published literature. We have implemented the Wolbachia program in Yogyakarta, and to spread the Wolbachia in all mosquito, so that the one who infected by the Wolbachia will not transmit the virus to human. And this is the result. This is Yogyakarta city is one of a city in Java. As you can see that the result of a reduction of dengue is less dengue in by 85% in Yogyakarta, and compared to other country, for example, like in Australia, they achieve more than 90%. And they also learn about the efficacy and also the cost effectiveness. But we continue this study in my city, not really the study, but we want to see the real world impact, because it's like in the Yogyakarta, they do the trial. It's like well maintained, but in Jakarta, where we implement this program in the program Jakarta Provincial program. So this program now expanding to one of the city in Jakarta is West Jakarta, and it's still ongoing. But so far we see that the breeding quite good, but we will need to follow up the result if there is a reduction of the dengue case for at least 2 to 3 years after we implement this program. So the other thing is the vaccine itself. As you know that Indonesia is the first country who approve the use of new vaccine TAK TAK vaccine, the new generation of vaccine, and it is according to GISAID's recommendation of dengue vaccine. So it is not nationally implemented, but it is regionally or locally implemented by each province. The aim of this implementation, I think, is triggered because we have the highest number of dengue cases in 2024. So in 2024, some of province actively implemented the dengue vaccine program in the city, but also it is embedded with the phase 4 study trial to measure the impact of reduction of the dengue cases, as well as to monitor the side effect, because one of the issue of dengue vaccine is the uh, antibody dependent enhancement. As you see in my earlier presentation, we have 4 serotype, but so far during the follow-up, we don't really see the adverse event following the immunization, and the safety is quite good. So for our research group, we are part of the DEN 401 study in Indonesia, including the other 2 countries like Thailand and Malaysia. But in Indonesia, we are in 3 provinces, which in my city, and I'm one of the PI of this study. We involving recruiting 5,000 participants who already got the dengue vaccine to do the active follow-up for dengue up to 3 years, but it's still ongoing, so I cannot share about the result of the study yet. I think the last is I want also to raise the issue about the other case. I have another baby born from the mother with fever and myalgia at day of delivery, and we don't really know the diagnosis at the time, the OBGY, and it is, I think, this case is really not well diagnosed in our country. This baby born quite good and discharged after 3 days, but at 3 days of age, he developed high-grade fever, 39 degrees Celsius, motile not active, and then sent back to the hospital, but she is quite stable. And at the time, because the neonatologists really worry because of late onset sepsis, they admitted to NICU and got treatment as the late onset sepsis. So this baby is quite stable, as you can see in this video. And because of persistent fever at day 7, they consulted to the ID, and then they realized that the CRP only less than 6 milligram per deciliter, and then after that we send the blood for the tropical panel PCR, which we found that this baby got the chikungunya, probably transmitted from the mother. So the final diagnosis is neonatal chikungunya. The reason why I also present this case because there are a lot of notification in my country that the trend of suspected chikungunya disease is increased in 2023 and 2025. And I think in the other part of the world, they also noticed that there are trend of chikungunya increase in some of the countries, and including my countries. And for example, like we are really underdiagnosed of the chikungunya, as you can see that only some of the city reported the chikungunya cases. I think the last for my presentation, I just want to raise the issue that symptom of dengue and other disease in tropical country can be overlapped, and currently no specific treatment for many tropical disease such as dengue and chikungunya, and also climate probably linked to the dengue, probably linked also to the increase of chikungunya. And prevention of dengue need comprehensive measure, including factor control and specific protection, such as vaccine. I think that's all from me. I will hand over to Mirna. Thank you.
Or to me. Thank you, Nina, for this really interesting presentation. You managed to squeeze a lot into these 20 minutes. Clinical cases, really interesting clinical cases, the public health impact, and the ongoing research. So I think everyone enjoyed it very much. If you have questions to Nina, please keep them until the end or drop them in the chat. In the end, we will have time for questions and discussion. But now we will continue with Eleni's presentation. So Dr. Eleni Katina is also a pediatric infectious disease consultant, and she works as a clinician at the Suetomo General Academic Hospital in Surabaya in Indonesia. She also lectures at the university and is currently doing her PhD in HIV, I think. But today she will talk about leprosy. And I think we are now switching a bit back to the hospital and to clinical cases. We're looking forward to your presentation, and I hand over to you, Leni. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Antonia and Mirna, for the beautiful introduction. Good evening, everyone. Maybe in other places, good morning and good afternoon. I'm Leni from Surabaya, Indonesia. I'm the colleague from the Nina and Riyadi. First of all, I want to say thank you to the committee giving us the very wonderful opportunity to join this excellent webinar. This is the first time we joined the NTD. And also, for me, I will share this one. Okay. So you can see? Okay. So I will present a case. It's not a study like Nina, but this case is remind us that the leprosy is not a disease in the past, especially in children, because when we find a leprosy in a child, it means the transmission is active and happening around us. We have to remind that we want to make it zero case like in a WHO roadmap. And this case is about a 12 years old girl with the multibacillary leprosy and with the erythema nodosum leprosum. She has a reaction and with a grade 2 disability. So it reflects that it was a diagnostic delay and treatment non-compliance and also the ongoing transmission around us. So I will start with the introduction that leprosy remains one of the neglected tropical disease that targeted for elimination by the by WHO roadmap. Beyond its physical deformity, this disease carries the psychosocial burden, like the facing stigma, discrimination from the patient, that it more serious impact than the deformity themselves. So when we detect the new cases of leprosy in children, it means the important indicator that the leprosy transmission is still going. And however, diagnostic leprosy in children is not easy, it's difficult, it's challenging, especially because the case in the leprosy is usually is subtle. So the skin lesion is minimal, and we also cannot check the evolution for the neurologist because it's difficult to express it's sensitive or low sensitive. So we have to higher our awareness and to strengthen our clinical to early diagnosis because it's fundamental to prevent the severe disability and even death. So let's move to the case. Yeah, this is the leprosy program from WHO to eliminate it. So from that background, I want to present the pediatric leprosy, especially highlight to the clinical spectrum and the risk factor for the continue and the management that need the multidisciplinary. So this is the case, 12 years old girl with a body weight 30 kilogram. She came to our hospital with the chief complaint weakness in all limbs and multiple wounds in the extremities and in the body. She also complained of numbness and stiffness of the digit. She has new nodule and ulcer and also multiple anesthetic patch in the body. She has been diagnosed as multibacillary leprosy, but she not compliant with the treatment, multi-drug treatment. And the mother of these children had also leprosy disease, but she refused treatment, and unfortunately, the mother was passed away 3 months ago before the children is admitted to our hospital, and all the whole families refused for screening and also chemoprophylaxis. So we move to the on physical examination. I will show you the picture. I made the full consent for this picture to present, and we can see that she has a face like a fascius, who called as fascius leonine, yeah, a lion-like appearance with the madarosis and the oedematus and facial skin thickening that show that this is the high infiltrated from the bacil. And she also has a peripheral nerve thickening in auricularis manus. In the extremity, we found that this child have multiple ulcer, deep ulcer, accompanying with yellowish slough, and it's some of them is covered with the crusty, and it show that it's like a delay healing. Maybe it's because of the poor blood flow to the in the circulation, and also indicating that tissue death and the wound healing that's very bad. So I'm sorry. From the other from the in the hand, we saw that this hand is have a motoric function in function. She has a claw hand and also the ulcer in the leg. So this symptom is included in the grade 2 disability. She also have a multiple nodule in this face that show that is a reaction. They include in the erythema nodosum leprosum is a type 2 reaction. She also anemic. And from the laboratory examination, she has a severe anemia, hypoalbuminemia, and also mild leukocytosis and hypokalemia. And from the slit skin smear, the bacterial index is high, +4, and the morphological index is so that it is active bacilli, 30%. And we did the skin biopsy of these children, and so that the biopsy is forming macrophage near this in the histopathology, and also acid phase bacil in the Ziehl-Neelsen smear. And we also did the PCR skin biopsy, and its result is positive for Mycobacterium leprae. And from this all the symptom and diagnostic laboratory, we diagnosed this patient with multibacillary leprosy with ENL reaction, grade 2 disability, red and live necrotic digit 1 to 5 in the pedis, and also severe malnutrition. So, and then, sorry. We made the team for this multidisciplinary therapy for this patient because it's very complex with all the things that happen in these children. And according to WHO, of course, we give the multi-drug therapy with the dapsone, rifampicin, and also clofazimine. And we also give the prednisone for the ENR reaction and give the antibiotic for the infection. We give this patient also the supportive treatment like the PRC transfusion because of the severe anemia and high calorie medical formula and also the supplements. From the dermatological care, we focus on the wound care to prevent the further necrosis and maybe could make the deformities more severe. And the other important thing is we make the psychiatric team for this patient with the physiotherapy focus to address the neuropathic pain and also the psychosocial burden like the stigma, feel discrimination, and also depression because of the disease. So this patient is we treat for the 2 weeks, almost 3 weeks, and then she getting better, improve, and she can discharge from the hospital with a better condition and follow up in our outpatient clinic. So as a discussion, despite the case of effort, actually leprosy is still persisting in many countries. Endemic countries, WHO said that 120 countries still have the leprosy, including Indonesia. Even from Global Leprosy Strategy 2021-2030 is zero disease, zero disability, zero stigma, and zero discrimination, but it's not easy, it's challenging. Because in the fact, Indonesia still has an increase in case with 31% of cases is resulting in a grade 2 disability. And in our country, the new case detection rate for the pediatric is especially in our province, also above target, the international target is 5%. Our new case detection rate is 5.7%. And this is the table from the study from the India that our new case from the children for the pediatric leprosy, Indonesia take place for number 2 after India for the highest number for the new pediatric case. It means that it should be make us very concerned about the ongoing transmission in the community. So as a seen in the globally, that into 2023, there is about 182,000 new leprosy cases occur and 5.6% of them is in children. And we see in Indonesia, like Nina said, we have also red area, but it's the dark red. So it's a very high burden of the cases. And we place the 3rd rank for the highest patient in the world after India and Brazil. And we also take a 2nd rank for the pediatric cases for the leprosy after India. In Indonesia itself, we record between 1,700 cases, new cases of with leprosy, and the majority is the case is in my province in East Java. This is the red is the high burden of the leprosy. My place in here Surabaya, but this patient is come from this red area. So this red area. So even East Java can reduce the number in recent years, but is still dominant for the other province for the case of the leprosy. So we are talking about transmission. We know that leprosy is disease with a long course. The incubation period is between 1 to 20 years. It makes the disease is under-recognized. So the transmission is still going and we don't realize about that. And the family contact is have the 9 times higher for the risk of transmission, especially when in the case is the mother. So it's like a prolonged exposure with the cases. And the multibacillary type is 14 times higher for the transmission. And In endemic area, the neighborhoods also increase the risk of transmission until the fourfold. And our patient in this case is in this case is her mother, since the patient is 6 years old, so it's very long time. So how to diagnose the leprosy? Actually, leprosy can be defined by primary clinically, and if we found one of these cardinal signs of the leprosy, we can sufficient that this is confirmed for the leprosy. One is a hypopigmented or reddish patch that definite sensory loss in the body, and the second is thickening peripheral nerve, usually is in the nervus auricularis or ulnar auricularis manus, and the positive skin smell from or biopsy from for the found of the acid fast bacilli. So even only one from the cardinal sign, we can confirm that we can say that this is a leprosy. So I want to remind that this is the early symptom of leprosy, why it's sometimes recognized or we cannot recognize because there is some the similar type also. I will show you in the next slide. This is the early symptom of leprosy. When we found the hypopigmented, this is like this is also in the child. This is the case from some of city in the city in my country. It's a hypopigmentation patch and or redness like a skin lesion like this. This is can be less sensitive on sensory loss, and if the disease is progress, it will show like a nodule and plaque, and this is the key feature of the leprosy is if we found the nerve thickening. This is the auricular manus, and it is in the pia. Okay, and for the neurological finding in leprosy, sometimes we can show that this is the nerve that usually can impact from the leprosy, and the effect from the motor dysfunction, like the eyelids can close and the claw hand, wrist drop and the foot drop, and also the sensory dysfunction make the risk for the ulceration and also injury because there is anesthesia or hypoesthesia. And for the autonomic disturbance, we can show that the patient come between the dry skin and also disturbance of the blood flow that make the ulcer or the necrosis is very delay for the healing. So like in my patient. So in the children with nerve thickening, the risk to develop deformity is higher, is 6.1 of 6-fold to become the developing deformity. So the WHO and Ridley and Joplin make the classification. Classification from the Ridley is especially from the tuberculoid. The range is from tuberculosis to lepromatosis, and it use the immunology response. If the immunology response is high, we will be tuberculosis. If the poor is become to lepromatosis. And WHO make it simplify. Only the two type is paucibacillary and multibacillary based on the number of the skin lesion. So, however, the children is not easy. It's difficult, and like I said before, that the clinical is often subtle and sensory testing is difficult. The slit skin smell positivity rate in the children less than 50 years is only very low. It's only 10%. Even we know that histopathology is depend on the many factors, but the other modalities diagnostic also is not too high in the children, like a PCR only 47%. So contact tracing is more valuable to detect the patient is leprosy is for the early detection in children. So when we found symptom in the children with the hypopigmentation, we should trace contact tracing is really the mother or the parent of the other neighborhood have the leprosy. So it's more available. So this is differential diagnosis. The skin manifestation that we make for the leprosy, like the white patch maybe in the vitiligo, pityriasis versicolor, psoriasis, or the redness, erythematous, and nodulation, like verruca vulgaris. But the key feature is the peripheral nerve thickening and also the less or loss sensitive or anesthesia in this patch. So that's the key point. So our patient came with erythema nodosum leprosum. Sorry, this is like a leprosy reaction mediated by T lymphocyte or antibodies. It can be present before, during, and after treatment, and it's divided to type 1 reversal and type 2 for erythema nodosum leprosum. In children, it's usually ANL is very uncommon, and it's usually seen in multibacillary type. But the study in our hospital in Dr. Sutomo for 9 years, there was 11% the cases of ENL in multibacillary children. This is the study that was conducted by our colleagues from the dermatology venerology department. And for the 9 years, we have this total 7 new patient leprosy in out of the 1,300 new cases, and mostly is the multibacillary type is larger than the paucibacillary type. So it's reflected the ongoing is still continue. Ongoing transmission is still happen. This is about the leprosy reaction. We have type 1 reversal reaction and type 2. For type 2 is the humoral immune response. It usually appear the nodule on the skin, and it usually happen in the borderline and lepromatous type. So the management, like I said previously, because the management need multidisciplinary treatment. So multi-drug treatment is the key point to treatment the leprosy, but we have to consider the other, like the corticosteroid for reaction for ENL, also for the concern for the monitor for the reaction, and then the psychosocial treatment and counseling. Yeah, so we have to counseling the patient that this disease can be cured, because if we give the multi-drug therapies, actually it's a curable disease. So this is the dose from the WHO guideline that it's divided between paucibacillary and multibacillary based on the long time for the treatment. So for PB is only 6 months and multibacillary for the 12 months. And the anemia in our patient have the anemia, and we know the anemia is a common complication in leprosy because of two condition. One is usually for the daily dapsone therapy that induce hemolytic, and this is occur in the 24.7%, and half of them is occur in the first 3 months. And the others that leprosy can induce the pro-inflammatory cytokines like such as TNF alpha, interleukin 1 and 6, that this cytokine is disrupt iron metabolism, decrease erythropoietin, and suppress the bone marrow. So the anemia in the leprosy because of the two destruction and the limitation or reduce the red blood production. So for the prognosis, it's depend on the several factors: state of the disease at diagnosis, early initiation and treatment, of course, patient access to the treatment of the patient, and also the compliance that we have to concern to the in the counseling. So with the start of the multi-drug therapy, within timely manner after the diagnosis, usually the leprosy is curable disease. But mostly patient came with a delayed treatment in the severe condition, like study that Henry and Colette reported, one of the risk factor to make a tenfold came led to the doctor is the fearing community isolation and also the not considering early symptoms. So this is the perspective from the health system that when we not consider that this is the early symptom, the serious triplet, the odd for the condition is worsened. So improving prognosis is require early diagnosis through both community awareness and also strengthening the health system. As a study that I put for the to show that the factor contributing to the delay, and this is the national program for leprosy in my country. We have the guideline and also the action plan for the eliminated for the leprosy. So in conclusion, what we learn from these cases, the lesson learned is even leprosy in children is challenging, but this is the important signal that we have the ongoing transmission, and it's also the public health warning sign. And we need to aware of the early sign like the hypopigmentation, along with hypoesthesia and anesthesia. We need to give the treatment is multidisciplinary treatment from the diagnostic or give the treatment monitoring the reaction and also contact tracing and the chemoprophylaxis. And children with grade 2 disability mean that signal of diagnostic is a delay and deserve multidisciplinary approach and program evaluation. And if we want, this is the picture that I put from the WHO website. If we want the zero stigma and zero discrimination, so the early detection in the children is essential. Maybe this my last slide. Thank you, Antonia and Mirna.
Thank you, Leni, for this very interesting talk on leprosy in children. It was really great also that you included so many pictures, because I think many people haven't seen leprosy in children, and maybe a few have seen it in adults, but even that is rare, at least in Germany. So thank you very much for this. And to everyone, keep your questions in mind for the discussion at the end, and you can always drop them in the chat so we can collect them for the discussion. We still have one more presentation by Dr. Riyadi Adrizain, who is from Bandung, West Java. It's my pleasure to introduce you, Dr. Riyadi. Dr. Riyadi is a medical doctor, and he holds a master and PhD of basic medical science. He's the chairman of the Infection and Prevention Control Committee at the Hasan Sadikin General Hospital, where he also works as a clinician. He's also a lecturer at the Universitas Padjadjaran in Bandung, West Java, Indonesia. And as a pediatrics infectious disease specialist, he not only cares about children with NTDs and severe infections, but he's also involved in various research projects, such as a phase 3 clinical trial on SARS-CoV-2 during the COVID-19 pandemic. And at the moment, he's working with the US CDC through the Global Action in Healthcare Network, where he does a prevalence survey of healthcare-associated infections. And he also works with the WHO on the implementation of healthcare-associated infections in Indonesia. So we are very happy that you're joining us today. Dr. Riyadi is with us in the webinar, but since he's traveling with the WHO at the moment, we decided to show a pre-recording of his talk to avoid any technical issues. But he's available for all your questions later, as are the other speakers. So thank you, Dr. Riyadi, for being here today. We're looking forward to your talk with the title Soil-Transmitted Helminthiasis Burden in Children and the relation to stunting. Over to you.
Hello, everyone. First of all, I want to say thank you to our moderator for the kindly introduction and for this opportunity. I would like to share my experience in Indonesia and also research that I'm done for my PhD that I hope can benefit all of us from sharing experience. I will tell you about and share with you about the soil transmitted helminth infection burden in children. So as a background, we know that 3.1 million children under 5 die because of malnutrition. Globally, 165 million children have height below their age. And one of the causes of this shortage is malnutrition. that can caused by deficiency of micro and macronutrient, and also it can be effect from chronic disease that we have to consider in low middle income country, helminth infection. Chronic infection have negative impact on nutritional status, and also if stunting happen, there will be lifetime consequences like mortality, IQ score, economy of the country. The cycle will be row and row and row if it happen in children. When the children become teenager, become productive age, they can produce children with underweight and have become stunted children. So from our perspective in Indonesia, Ministry of Health report show the prevalence in Indonesia it's more than 20%, and 20 to 30% is affect preschool children, and the most highest population that affect is children that was in the elementary school. And we can see this parasite can affect how the cell react and also how the allergen react. All of this will impair the immune function and also have impact on the growth of the children. And as we know today, soil transmitted helminth was included in 20 neglected tropical diseases that remain a global public health problem. In populated that decently very high populated area with the poor sanitation, limited clean water access, low education level, health service that inadequate, there's a risk of helminthiasis. Ascaris lumbricoides still the most common and has the highest burden. They can release more than 200,000 eggs per day. So imagine if children contract with this and they don't have a proper sanitation, that will be one person can produce more than 200,000 eggs per day. And there's a lot of research that want to explore what is the connection with the stunting. And we know in the low middle income country like Indonesia, stunting is a problem that become bigger and bigger. So the risk factor, low education, poor socioeconomy, inadequate sanitation, warm and humid climates in Indonesia, also immune disturbance, all can become the risk factor of someone to be contracted with the helminthiasis. And we can see in low and middle income country with agricultural as one of the main resource, main profit, there will be a lot of livestock. And sometimes the location is very near with the place where people live and also where the children live. So the double burden of malnutrition is prevalent in low and middle country and driven by the rapid change of dietary characteristic and also by increase of consumption of the unhealthy food. So this is my research. I do this research during COVID era. I collect more than 600 samples from rural area in Bandung, that is my city in West Java, Indonesia, and we see how much is the burden of the HTI infection in stunted and also in the normal height children. And I do the blood examination for the interleukin and also for vitamin D, because right now we know that vitamin D has much role, not only in the children but in the adult, especially in immunology and also in allergy reaction. So from what I found, from what I get from my research, there's an incidence that happen in short stature, also in normal stature patient. Even though the number is higher in the short stature, but statistically it's not different. So we can see that the number is between 5% and 3% and no significant difference. So susceptibility was similar between two groups. And the prevalence, if we saw, is less likely in my research than what Ministry of Health was given, is 28%. why it's lower? Because I do this research during pandemic, but there's important thing that we know from my research that during pandemic, usually people stay at home. So it will impact how the ecology, how the environment will spread of this disease. It has a very good information that we got from this number. And also, the observer of the study show there's no effect of the linear growth because the prevalence is not significantly different between two groups, suggestion that this chronic infection may have not been persist long enough to influence child growth. However, 65% children with STI infection were classified in undernourished or severe malnourished. Therefore, we can see the impact if we do the intervention through the warming program, and we can use CATOCAT technique that simple and very cheap, because if we do the intervention early, children may have malnutrition but doesn't impact his height. So early treatment, I think it will make a good prognosis. So this is the technique that we use, CATOCATs. You can see from the picture, it's very easy, but we can identify until the number of infection, number of egg that was produced from the feces of the impacted children. So this is inexpensive, widely used, and sensitively detecting moderate and heavy infection. So how about the species? My research also showed the same data. The Ascaris lumbricoides was dominant, and it is consists the high prevalence of Ascaris is found among children aged 2 to 10 years. So why it's have a highest burden? Because we know it's very related tightly with the hygiene and the sanitation. And dual infection may occur. Well, we found some of the cases have more than one species, and it may be occur depending on the host susceptibility and transmission risk, including the environmental factors such as poor sanitation. How about the education? We found that cases was more likely happen with the lower education of the paternal. So we can see that child health is influenced by parental education, which is associated with the literary level, media exposure, how they leading to improve their health knowledge. And in Indonesia, because we are very much involved by traditional way, father education is positively associated with health related behavior. Decisions regarding child health are often made by fathers in Indonesia. So children without fathers, without guidance of their fathers, will tend to have poorer health status compared with fathers that have higher education. We can also see that the water source also have impact on the risk of infection of STH, and also the distance from the water source and toilet, like the literature said, how livestock can impact the progressivities or the incidence of the STH. My research also show the same result. Though the water resource, distance between water source and toilet were associated 4.13-fold increased risk of STI infection if there's a more prevalence happen in the poor access to sanitation. The other things about the personal hygiene, you can see that the cleanness of the toenails has an impact. Individual personal hygiene, particularly nail hygiene, was significant factor associated. We see that education on personal and environmental hygiene is very necessary, because the studies show that such education have highly significant impact. So this is the thing that maybe we can do. It's easy, but have highly impact to reduce the risk of STH. So from all the results that I found from my research, so socioeconomic and environment factor play a major role, both in pediatric population in general, particularly among children with short stature. So how about the risk of the stunting or malnutrition? We can see from this picture that STH infection can cause decrease of appetite, absorption, iron deficiency, gastrointestinal problem, that all can leading to malnutrition, stunting, and cognitive impairment. So we need a further targeted empirical research among those potential vulnerable among stunted patients to see what is the relation between those factors stunted with the STH or chronic condition. We can see that malnutrition due to the chronic condition will affect the systematic process. The chronic systematic inflammation can cause a chronic growth disorder. So vitamin D is one of the vitamin that can impact the ability of immune response. So that's the thing, the key point that I want to see the relation between stunting and STH. So I have these two publications that show the higher burden of STH infection with a lower level of interleukin 5 and interleukin 13, and also vitamin D play role in the burden of the STH infection. Children with a lower of interleukin 5, 13, and vitamin D level, 25 OHD, will be more vulnerable to become ill if they were infected by STH. This is a key point that I think can affect how we treat STH children. So we can see that vitamin D has role in pathogen elimination to stop over-inflammation reaction, and it will be affect the growth impairment and can cause the short stature. In Indonesia Pediatric Society show data that prevalence in Indonesia is quite high, 30.8% stunting was recorded. And we can see from this research, from research that I do, there was a tendency for children with short stature and vitamin D deficiency or insufficiency to be higher burden of STH. Well, even though there was no significantly different by statistics. So I also see the cutoff point 25 OHD as a predictor, and we can see there's a cutoff point that comparison between the level of severity of children with the short stature, and we can see the value is impact the burden of STH. So this is how the pathogenesis that was proposed, and we can see that vitamin D will impact the linear growth directly, and also it will impact how the macrophage work, how the anti-helminth immunity work, how the tissue impairment will work, and we can see there's a lot of place where vitamin D has impact. So include how the person will heal if they were infected by STH. I will move forward a little bit faster because time. And from that data, we have conclusion that maintaining 25 OHD at certain level will provide benefit to interleukin 13 and help to maintain the balance of immune response. The importance of interleukin 13 and Th2 memory cell become clearer. If the process were disrupted, the load of the helminth will be increased. The mucosal barrier is damaged, and the tissue will be prevented to be healed. And all of that will affect how the burden and how the clinical condition of STH patient will happen. So we suggest playing outside is important, and also we suggest and consider to education our parents, especially pediatrician to parents, to have a practice clean and healthy living behavior for the children, playing outside, and also including the supplementation of vitamin D to become one of the measurement to work against infection, especially STH. In Indonesia, we have this policy, the deworming program. Incidence rate of STH is 3.6, and also in area where the stunting number is higher, we give mass prophylaxis treatment, MDT, much often. We give it twice a year. Why? Because we see there's impact of the STH and the condition of stunting. So the warming program is implemented since 2009, but there's a several problem that affect this program, including from the national level, the lack of compliance of the society. Regional level is difficult to have the prevalence data, because when we ask population, especially from student, when we give the education at school, when they bring it home and we need them to examine their stool, sometimes they not go back with the sample. And also in the local level, the same area, some area is already do the MDH, but other area is not doing it frequently. There's a problem with this deworming national policy. But I hope by the data, the latest data that show the importance of the STS infection and stunting, our Minister of Health will endorse more for this program. So for the strategy of prevention, we have to continuous monitoring of this condition for our children, and to treat it as soon as possible if we can diagnose STH was occurred. And also we need to have access to healthcare alone. It's not sufficient to eliminate. The eliminated needed. This show the needed of more comprehensive integrated approach, including WASH, water sanitation and hygiene strategies, to improve water access. Because from my research, we can show how the sanitation, the water sanitation impacts the risk of STH infection in children. So as a conclusion, the prevalence among children with short stature is 5.6, and there's associated between 20 OHD level with the occurrence of STI infection in children. And there's a simultaneous association between serum 25 OHD, IL-4, IL-5, and IL-30, and the distance of between clean water source and toilet with the prevalence of STIs in children with short stature. So as a practical recommendation, we need to do the routine surveillance. We have to educate more about the personal hygiene, and the provincials need to access the clean water and adequate sanitation level. Primary healthcare is the area in the area of at risk of the STI infection should strengthen promotion program through education of personal hygiene, the use of clean water, as well as preventive program in form of mass drug treatment for helminth infection. Vitamin D supplementation should be considered as a routine provided to the child health service, as even sufficient vitamin D level may still be associated with vulnerability of STH and can influence immune response. But in area where the high risk, we hope this strategy of giving vitamin D supplementation can help prevent more severe condition when the children was contracted with helminth. Thank you. That's all for my participation. I hope what I share can be benefit to you all. Thank you again, and I give this room back to the moderator.
Thank you very much, Dr. Liadi, for this interesting presentation. We will now open the discussion. I already saw one question in the chat, but you can also feel free to raise your hand on Zoom if you have any more questions. If you want to ask directly, then please raise your hand. If not, maybe let's start right away with the first question in the chat from Isaac Effendi. This was a question to Leni. How's the program of the single-dose rifampicin for prevention of contact persons running in Indonesia?
Thank you. Thank you, Mirna. Thank you, Isaac Effendi. Yeah, give the single dose rifampicin is one of the strategy in our country, and we give for the post-exposure prophylaxis. We have the 5 strategy. One is early detection. The second is give the mass treatment, like a single dose rifampicin, and one there is a 5 area that receive the pilot project from the SDR, include my province in East Java, and the follow up show that this is the give the good improvement or less transmission with the SDR, and the third is like active surveillance, we detection the case, and the fourth is give the education and promoting to the healthcare that, and also for the community to reduce the stigma, and also give the like a collaboration inter cross section in sectional, we multi collaboration with the other parts. So yeah, we give the single dose rifampicin in the endemic area, and it's like a post-exposure prophylaxis. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And there's a next question already from Wisal Balla regarding dengue. This is to Nina. How does Wolbachia actually work? How is it induced to the mosquitoes? And you mentioned it is feasible. I would like to implement it in my country. And I would kindly ask for more information if possible, just as a short explanation.
Thank you for the question. Yeah, it's always interesting to see the entomologists play with the Wolbachia. So basically for the Wolbachia, so they have the method to give the Wolbachia to the mosquito. So for example, I will show you the picture. This one. Let me share my screen. So they have the technology to give the Wolbachia to the mosquito, and then after that it's like in the apa sih ya, feel like the what should I call it? It's on the like in the breeding area, so they give the Wolbachia with certain technology, and then after that, if Wolbachia already infected the mosquito, and then they will release the mosquito who already infected with Wolbachia, and then we need to wait until the Wolbachia met with the wild mosquito and passing on the Wolbachia to the uninfected mosquito, and then after that if already infected, then they will the Wolbachia itself will spread to the uninfected mosquitoes, and the over time the population of Wolbachia infected mosquito will increase, and then the uninfected or the wild mosquito will be reduced one by one. So there is another unique things in Wolbachia. So in the Wolbachia, especially in male mosquito. So when male mosquito with Wolbachia met with wild female mosquito without Wolbachia, those female will lay eggs, but they won't hatch. But interestingly, when male mosquito with Wolbachia met with females with Wolbachia, all of other offspring with will carry Wolbachia. The other scheme is when female mosquitoes with Wolbachia met with males without Wolbachia, only the females of offspring will carry Wolbachia. I'm not the entomologist, but it's like the schematic for the Wolbachia itself. But interestingly, mosquito without Wolbachia will transmit the viruses because there is no like a certain mechanism of Wolbachia that can block the virus transmission. But if already infected by Wolbachia, and then the Wolbachia infected mosquito will not transmit the viruses to the human. I hope this answer your question because it's like very schematic situation of how the Wolbachia release. But during the release of Wolbachia mosquitoes, we can reach the unsuccessful what should I call breeding. We need to check if the Wolbachia itself will stay in the mosquito or not. So that's one of the challenge. What my province do now, we won't see the real world effectiveness of Wolbachia because of the Wolbachia implementation in like certain area like urban city in Jakarta is quite challenging. We realize also when we target to certain number, we sometimes not reach the certain number. So it is one of the challenge to implement the Wolbachia. So we need to also observe if the infected mosquito will stay infected. Sorry, I didn't really clear to explain it because I'm not the entomologist, but basically, yeah, like that. I hope this answer. Sorry.
Thank you
Yes,
very
thank
much.
you very much.
Maybe one more question to you, Nina. Maybe you can answer it in 2 sentences because we are running a bit out of time. But just one question from Tina to you. What are the differences with how dengue and chikungunya are clinically managed?
So it is, I think for the chikungunya and dengue, the main treatment is supportive treatment. But for the dengue, we need to observe the critical phase because the dengue itself prominently will present it with the plasma leakage. So for this neonatal dengue, in my cases, it's like quite challenging to diagnose the dengue if we don't really know the status of the mother, because sometimes we will miss the time to get the fever. So the clue is for neonatal dengue, usually it's not it at the present at the delivery because it takes some time to become viremic. So usually the clue for the neonatal dengue, we need to observe the neonates up to 7 days in to detect the first symptom of dengue. Luckily, in this patient, we can detect the neonatal dengue at the 3rd day of the illness. It is also happen in the neonatal chikungunya. They will need sometimes to become viremic. So in our case, it's also 3 days after delivery. But specifically for neonatal dengue, our experience, they can also present it with the shock, but in chikungunya, it rare to neonates to develop such as like the shock or like plasma leakage in dengue. Usually, the prominent symptom is fever for the neonatal chikungunya. But for the big children, older children, the dengue prominently present with the plasma leakage symptoms such as, for example, if there is a symptom of warning sign like vomiting, and then also a symptom of abdominal pain, warning sign, it can be happen in dengue. But in chikungunya, the prominent symptom is mostly about the myalgia, involvement of the extremity, the arthritis and headache, and also the rashes. So it will not presenting with the plasma leakage itself. So it's like milder compared to the dengue. So in my setting, we are prominent with DEN 2 and DEN 3 in children. We are afraid of the symptom of dengue shock syndrome because usually DEN 2 and DEN 3 will cause more severe cases compared to the other serotype. So for the adult dengue can be presenting with the hemorrhage as well as with the shock. But for chikungunya, the symptom in adult almost similar with older children. So usually with fever, and then myalgia, arthralgia. But we need to also aware of the complication of chikungunya, such as they also can induce the, for example, uveitis, retinitis, as well as